The moment Jonathan's voice echoed through the receiver, cold and unfamiliar yet devastatingly familiar, Cynthia felt her breath seize in her chest, as if her body was only just now registering the gravity of the storm she had unknowingly walked into. Her fingers trembled around the stem of her wine glass as she desperately tried to maintain composure, but inside her mind was a torrent. Images flashing of all those stolen nights, whispered promises in candle-lit secrecy. The way Jonathan's hands had traced her skin like a prayer, and now it all felt like a meticulously written script, performed perfectly by a man who was never who he claimed to be. She didn't know whether to feel betrayed, humiliated, or heartbroken. Perhaps all three, or perhaps something far more dangerous: curiosity. Because if Jonathan had known who she was this entire time, why had he let it continue for so long? Why had he played the part of the elusive pretty boy so convincingly? And more importantly, what did he stand to gain from such an elaborate deception? Her pulse thundered in her ears as her husband, Philip, returned to the table, blissfully ignorant, or so she thought, of the psychological earthquake taking place within her. As she downed another glass of wine to silence the questions screaming in her skull, she couldn't help but glance again at Jonathan, no, Mr. Bennet, standing aloof, untouchable, and somehow more magnetic than ever in his chilling indifference. Every interaction from the past 3 years twisted into something sinister. His insistence on anonymity, his avoidance of photos, the way he never spoke of his work or background, and how he would disappear for weeks only to return with a renewed hunger in his eyes. At the time, she had chalked it up to mystery, to the thrill of forbidden love. But now she saw it for what it was: control. Calculated, patient, precise. He had inserted himself into her life like a parasite, fed on her loneliness, and woven himself into her routine so seamlessly that she hadn't questioned it, hadn't dared to look beyond the lust and the escape he offered from her sterile marriage. But now, under the piercing lights of one of the city's grandest galas, his mask had slipped. Or perhaps it had been ripped away by the cruel hand of fate. And yet what rattled her more than anything was the aching part of her soul that still yearned for him, still hoped that maybe there had been some truth buried beneath the lies, that maybe in some corner of his twisted mind he had actually cared. But even that flicker of hope began to wither as the evening progressed. The moment Philip approached Jonathan with a glass raised high and a smile too wide, she felt her stomach twist. She could see it coming. The inevitable collision between her past and present, the unmasking of truths she hadn't dared to imagine. And when Jonathan, with all the regal disdain of a fallen god, publicly rejected Philip and spat his surname like a curse, she felt the blood drain from her face. Her husband's confusion, the stifled whispers of the crowd, the subtle widening of eyes, all of it crashed around her like a tidal wave. The name Yates had become a mark of shame in seconds, and the tremor in Jonathan's voice when he spat, "You should ask Mrs. Yates," sent shockwaves through the room, turning every curious glance into a blade slicing through her composure. Cynthia sat frozen as 100 eyes pinned her to her seat like insects under glass. Her mind screamed at her to stand, to deny, to perform, but her body betrayed her with silence. Jonathan had thrown her to the wolves with a single line, and yet she couldn't help but think there was something more behind it. An unspoken message, a twisted invitation. Did he want her to admit everything? Or was this his revenge for being discarded like an afterthought with $5 million and a cowardly farewell? The worst part was that she didn't even know what she felt anymore. Was it guilt for hurting him, or fury for being played? Was it fear of being exposed, or a sick satisfaction that the truth was finally bleeding through the cracks? As the evening carried on and the room returned to its orchestrated cheer, Cynthia found herself spiraling, barely, hearing the clinking glasses and half-hearted conversations around her. Her mind was locked on Jonathan's profile across the room, his unyielding posture, his unreadable eyes, the ghost of a smirk that haunted his lips. If he had orchestrated all of this, what else had he set in motion? Had their affair been part of some long game, some vendetta against Philip? Was she merely a pawn, or had she been something more, something irreplaceable? But why reveal himself now, after all this time, and what would he do next? With every breath, the room seemed to close in around her, suffocating with secrets, drenched in perfume and power plays. Cynthia realized then that she had never truly known the man she loved. Or perhaps she had, and simply refused to see him for what he really was. Either way, the mask was gone, and in its place stood a storm with a face she could never forget. And the terrifying truth was, she wasn't sure if she wanted to run from it or walk right into its eye. The gala carried on like a well-rehearsed symphony of false smiles, strategic laughter, and clinking crystal. But for Cynthia, everything around her had blurred into a haze of panic and paranoia as she floated between conversations with her mind spinning wildly, haunted by the sensation that every movement she made was being tracked, analyzed, catalogued. Especially now, with Jonathan's revelation hanging in the air like a loaded gun pointed squarely at her reputation. She tried to convince herself that the audience had already dismissed his biting comment as a bizarre outburst or an inside joke, but the glances that lingered a beat too long, the smirks exchanged between socialites, and the icy silence that enveloped her like a noose tightening with every step told a much different story. She retreated toward the quieter edge of the ballroom, seeking refuge beneath the golden chandeliers and the illusion of distance, when her phone buzzed inside her purse, a sharp, startling vibration that nearly caused her to drop her glass. She pulled it out with trembling fingers, half expecting Jonathan's name to flash across the screen again, but instead, it was an unknown number. The message was short, typed in simple lowercase letters. "Did you really think secrets stayed buried in that villa?" Her breath caught in her throat. The villa, their villa, had always been sacred, isolated from the cruel world outside, a place where time froze and consequences didn't exist. That was where she had lived her double life, kissed Jonathan like he was salvation, and whispered lies to herself about safety. She stared at the message, her heartbeat a war drum in her chest, her thoughts unraveling faster than she could contain them. Who had sent this? Jonathan? Someone else? Was he working with another party? Had they been watched all this time? Her thumb hovered above the reply button, but a second message appeared before she could type. "Check your inbox. Upstairs. West Wing." Her throat dried instantly, and despite her better judgment, or perhaps driven by the same reckless instinct that had gotten her entangled with Jonathan in the first place, Cynthia tucked her phone into her purse and made her way toward the west corridor, heart pounding, nerves flaring with every step she took away from the safety of the crowd. The hallway leading upstairs was cordoned off, guarded by thick red ropes and a security guard who gave her a questioning glance. But she slipped him a smile, feigned innocence with disarming grace, and muttered something about a migraine and needing a quiet place to recover. Whether he believed her or simply recognized her last name and chose not to interfere, he stepped aside. Upstairs, the atmosphere shifted. The music below sounded distant, ghostly, and the silence pressed against her like invisible hands. Cynthia moved carefully through the corridor until she reached a heavy oak door marked with a gold placard that simply read, "Archives." Her hand trembled as she turned the knob. Inside, the room was dimly lit, lined with antique shelves filled with documents, boxes, and portraits of forgotten ancestors staring down at her with blank, judging eyes. On the center table, illuminated by a single overhead light, lay a manila folder addressed to her in handwriting she couldn't quite place. With hesitant fingers, she opened it, and her world fell apart in slow motion. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some intimate, others invasive, all unmistakably real. Her and Jonathan at the villa, from every angle imaginable, laughing over breakfast, kissing under moonlight, lying tangled in sheets, walking by the pool, but none of them were selfies, and none looked posed. These were surveillance photos, taken without their knowledge. She felt sick. Someone had been watching them, documenting everything, and if she hadn't known before, now she understood. This was bigger than just a lover's betrayal. This was premeditated. She staggered back a step, only to hear a soft click behind her, the unmistakable sound of the door closing. She spun around, heart in her throat, but saw no one. Yet. Then a voice cut through the silence like a razor through silk. "You left the front door wide open, Cynthia." A woman stepped from the shadows, tall, elegant, with dark red lips and eyes like polished glass. She wore a satin dress the color of midnight and carried herself like royalty, cold, precise, lethal. Who are you?" Cynthia whispered, throat dry. The woman smiled without warmth. "I'm the woman Jonathan's mother wanted him to marry." That single sentence struck Cynthia like a blow. "He never told you, did he? That he was promised to someone else while playing Romeo with you?" Cynthia backed away, her legs brushing the table. "Why are you showing me this? What do you want?" The woman's expression didn't change. "To see if you're worth all the damage you've caused." She circled the table slowly. "Jonathan was never supposed to get attached. You were a distraction, a means to provoke your husband. But then he started slipping, changing the plan. He cut contact with us. And you—" She laughed, low and venomous. "You thought you mattered." Cynthia tried to speak, but her lips wouldn't move. "There's more at stake than your pathetic marriage," the woman continued. "The villa is built on land your family owns. And that land sits atop the entrance to something worth billions. That's what Jonathan wanted at first. That's why he targeted you." The world tilted. But what he didn't plan for, her eyes narrowed, was falling for you. Cynthia's knees buckled slightly. "I don't believe you," she whispered. "Good," the woman replied coldly. "Doubt is useful. It keeps you quiet." She dropped something on the table, a small recording device. "When you're ready to make a deal, press play. And pray that whatever loyalty Jonathan still has for you doesn't burn away in the fire he's about to start." With that, she turned and vanished into the hallway, her heels tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. Cynthia stood there, heart shattered, staring at the folder of lies and truths, wondering if she'd ever know the difference again. The moment Cynthia returned to the villa, the place that once felt like a sacred cocoon built of whispered lies and fragile dreams, it was as though the very walls had begun to breathe differently, no longer wrapping her in comfort, but instead suffocating her with a chilling sense of betrayal and buried history she had never dared to question. And as she walked past the ivy-covered gates, the familiar creak of the iron closing behind her sounded more like the bars of a gilded cage than the door to sanctuary. Every corner now seemed tainted, the pool reflecting a version of herself she could barely recognize, and the rooms echoed with the ghosts of their stolen moments. But now they felt like hauntings, not memories. The silence screamed louder than ever before as she drifted through the place, each footstep tapping a drumbeat of dread against marble floors that had once shimmered beneath their midnight dances. Her mind repeated the words of the woman from the gala: "Promise to another means to provoke your husband worth billions." And Cynthia, for the first time in her carefully crafted double life, began to see just how deeply she'd been played, not only by Jonathan, but by an entire web of motives, allegiances, and secrets that had coiled around her without her ever noticing. The thought that their affair had been nothing more than a calculated strategy to gain access to her family's land made her stomach churn. But even worse was the idea that somewhere along the line, Jonathan had deviated from that strategy, had broken the rules for her, and now everything was unraveling because of that deviation. In a burst of desperate resolve, she went into the study, the room where Jonathan had once sprawled across the leather couch reading poetry with mock seriousness, quoting lines about doomed lovers and laughing in a way that made her think he could never truly belong to a world of suits and empires. She began searching. The woman at the gala had implied that Jonathan had been hiding things, and Cynthia, consumed by the need to know the truth for herself, tore open drawers, sifted through notebooks, removed wall panels she'd never noticed before, until she finally discovered a narrow safe hidden behind a false bookshelf. Her hands trembled as she entered the passcode, his birthday, and to her astonishment, it clicked open. Inside were files, technical blueprints, geological surveys, even contracts drafted in languages she couldn't read. But what stole her breath were the photos. Of her family, of the land around the villa taken from satellite angles. And then, buried beneath it all, a small handwritten letter addressed simply, "To the woman I never meant to love." She unfolded it with unsteady hands. The ink was rushed, smudged in places, and the handwriting matched his, Jonathan's. But it was raw, unguarded. In the letter, he confessed that it had all begun as a mission, commissioned by an international syndicate that wanted to acquire the land discreetly, using a fabricated identity and charm to win Cynthia's trust. He admitted that he had been trained, groomed, and placed into her life with surgical precision. But then, somewhere between the second winter and your fourth attempt at baking that god-awful lemon tart, he had lost control. He had stopped reporting back. He had lied to his own handlers. He had even tried to convince the syndicate to abandon the plan, to let him sever the contract and live quietly with her. But they refused. Because the land beneath the villa wasn't just valuable, it was mythic. Beneath it was an abandoned Cold War facility, one that, according to legend, housed something more dangerous than weapons. Files, proof, secrets that could dismantle entire governments. Her family's estate had unknowingly sat on top of Pandora's box. The villa was the key. The letter ended with an ominous line. "If you're reading this, then I've either failed or I'm being hunted again. Either way, they'll come for you next." Cynthia collapsed into the armchair, mind reeling with the weight of the truth. Jonathan had been both villain and victim, puppet and rebel. She could no longer hate him, but trusting him now seemed just as impossible. She took the documents and fled the villa before nightfall, instinct screaming that she was no longer safe there. Back in the city, she rented a discreet suite under a different name, began scanning the files, and reaching out anonymously to anyone who could verify the information. Every lead confirmed the nightmare. Her family's land was at the center of an international operation, and Jonathan's betrayal had derailed something much bigger than just their romance. Then came the message. A simple envelope slid beneath her door late one evening, containing a single photograph. Jonathan, beaten, bloodied, handcuffed in a room she didn't recognize. And on the back, scrawled in the same sharp handwriting, "You can still save him. But you'll have to choose what matters more, him or the world." Cynthia stood frozen in that moment, the air charged with a single decision that would determine not only Jonathan's fate, but the destiny of everything she had once believed in. And as the shadows outside lengthened and her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, she realized the truth was no longer something she could run from. The villa hadn't just been a home for secrets. It was the battlefield for something far greater. And she was already standing at the center of it. The night Cynthia decided to surrender everything she had ever known, the city was drowning in rain, and as she stood at the rooftop edge of the old broadcasting tower, exactly where the coordinates in the final file had led her, clutching a briefcase full of encrypted drives and forged diplomatic letters that could incinerate the world order if made public, her heart pounded with a rhythm of fury, love, and an overwhelming sense of finality, because this wasn't just about Jonathan anymore, or her husband Philip, or the cruel farce of a marriage she'd endured to maintain the illusion of dignity. It was about waking up from the lie she had built her life upon, and finally facing the monster that had always watched from the shadows. Power, its seduction, its appetite, and its price. The rooftop was deserted, save for one figure waiting beneath a rusted maintenance light. The woman in the satin dress, Jonathan's fiancée, handler, tormentor, her red lips pressed together, her heels clicking once as she stepped forward and said, without malice or triumph, "You brought the files." Cynthia didn't respond. She simply raised the briefcase and placed it on the edge of the railing, water running down her arms like blood, the weight of the case pulling her forward until she was one gust of wind away from plunging into the blackness below. "Where is he?" Cynthia asked, voice sharp, fragile. "Safe," the woman replied coolly. "For now. He's still alive, still loyal to something." Cynthia's fingers trembled. "You don't want the land anymore," she said. "You want the information, the leverage. You want to control the people behind it." The woman smiled, slow and lethal. "We always did, but the land was our back door, and Jonathan was our skeleton key." Cynthia almost laughed. "And I was just a lock to be picked." "No," the woman said, her expression hardening. "You were the one thing that ruined our entire plan, and the only reason he's still breathing is because he betrayed us. For you." Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the pain behind Cynthia's eyes, the years of loneliness, the betrayal, the wine-soaked nights staring at the villa ceiling, wondering who she had become. "Why not just kill me?" she whispered. The woman tilted her head. "Because you've become far more useful than we anticipated. Your family's name, your proximity to power, your silence, if we have it, keeps everything neat." She stepped closer. "But here's the real question, Cynthia. Is he worth it?" In that moment, something in Cynthia snapped, not in weakness, but in clarity. She reached into her coat, pulled out the audio recorder the woman had given her back at the gala, and held it high in the air. "You thought I'd make a deal. You thought I'd protect my family's legacy and hand you the world. But I already sent copies of everything in this briefcase to 6 newsrooms, 3 embassies, and one old friend who knows how to start a fire with a whisper. This," she gestured to the recorder, "isn't leverage anymore. It's your confession." For the first time, the woman's mask cracked, her eyes narrowing with real anger. "You stupid girl," she hissed. "You have no idea what you've done." Cynthia's hand hovered near the case, her fingers brushing its handle. "I've done what he would have done if he hadn't loved me. I've chosen truth, even if it burns us all." The woman lunged forward, but before she could reach the briefcase, a shot rang out from the rooftop doorway. The woman collapsed to the ground with a scream, her arm bleeding, and from the darkness behind her, Jonathan appeared, bloody, limping, face bruised but alive, holding a small silver pistol with both hands shaking. "Step away from her," he said, voice cracked, pain seeping through every word. Cynthia's knees nearly buckled. "Jonathan!" He ran to her, pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like armor. "They tried to break me," he whispered into her hair. "But the only thing I was afraid of losing was you." She pressed her forehead to his. "I thought you used me." "I did," he said honestly. "At first. But you ruined everything. You made me feel like I belonged to something real." They didn't need to say more. The sirens in the distance signaled the coming reckoning, but neither of them flinched. Together, they pushed the briefcase from the railing, sending it crashing into the alley far below, shattering open and spilling its contents into the floodwaters. "It's done," she said. But Jonathan shook his head. "No. Now it starts." As they descended the tower, Cynthia's phone lit up with breaking news. Leaked files exposing secret war programs, property scams, political payoffs, and the revival of old ghosts thought buried during the Cold War. Names flashed across the screen. Some they knew, some they feared, some they loved. The world was shifting, spinning toward chaos. But she had chosen the truth. Not Jonathan, not Philip, not herself. The truth. And as the rain began to slow and the morning light cracked across the horizon, Cynthia looked at the man beside her. The man who had deceived her, protected her, broken and rebuilt her. And she knew this wasn't a happy ending. It was a true one. And that made it more powerful than any lie ever whispered in the dark.